Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and the Echo of Dying Roses, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marple. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Roses Bloomed at Midnight. The rain fell in a steady whisper over the village of Larkswood, tapping like faint fingertips against the ivy-clad windows of Everdale Hall. Inside the grand old manor, the warmth of firelight flickered across polished mahogany and silver trays, and the scent of roast pheasant and claret still lingered in the air. The dinner party had begun with the easy laughter of old acquaintances, the kind that carried 1,000 unspoken grievances beneath the surface. It was the sort of night where secrets stirred more quickly than the soup. Miss Marple, seated near the end of the table, beside a rather dull colonel and an anxious young pianist, had watched everything with quiet attention. Her hands, folded delicately in her lap, never trembled even as she listened to Lady Margaret Darrow speak in that regal, measured tone that commanded the room without ever raising in pitch. Lady Margaret, mistress of Everdale Hall, wore a deep plum gown and a string of pearls that seemed to throb like veins under the candlelight. She had a voice made for authority and eyes like iced glass. At precisely 10 minutes past 11, just after the brandy had been poured, Lady Margaret had excused herself. "Only a moment," she had said, with her usual poise. "There's a letter I must attend to before I forget. Old business. You know how it is." No one gave it much thought at the time. The conversation shifted to the peculiar demise of Sir Aubrey Finch, found dead in his library with a hunting knife in his back, yet all the windows locked from the inside. Miss Marple offered no opinion, though her blue eyes were fixed on the crumbling ash at the tip of the vicar's cigar. But the real mystery of the evening did not reveal itself until nearly midnight, when the maid, Alice, returned from the kitchens to find Lady Margaret's study door locked and no reply from within. There was a strange pause. Then several of the guests stood. Colonel March, red-cheeked and impatient, banged on the heavy oak. "Lady Margaret, are you quite well?" No answer. It was Miss Marple who suggested the key might still be inside the lock. It was. The butler, grim and reluctant, fetched the small brass service key from the cellar cabinet. The door creaked open into darkness, broken only by the dim flicker of firelight. Lady Margaret sat at her writing desk, slumped slightly to one side, her left hand dangling loosely at her side. Her right hand lay stiff upon the blotter, curled tightly around a rose. There was no sound but the hiss of the dying fire. Miss Marple stepped forward before anyone could speak. She took in the scene with a single, deliberate glance. The room was tidy, no sign of struggle. The glass of sherry on the side table remained untouched. One window was cracked open just a sliver, letting in the soft patter of rain. And there, by the base of the fireplace, just under the edge of the carpet, a second rose petal, torn as if by haste or force, lay crushed into the wool. Dr. Fitzhugh was summoned from the village, his arrival delayed by the storm and the poor condition of the roads. By the time he arrived, the guests had been moved back to the drawing room. Lady Margaret was quite dead. "Heart," the doctor murmured. "Sudden failure. These things do happen. But his words were met with silence. Miss Marple remained in the study, her eyes moving from the tightly clenched fingers to the single rose, too fresh for the hour and too unusual for the season. "Lady Margaret's roses do not bloom in October," she said quietly to the maid Alice, who stood pale as bone at the door. "She had them cut back only last week, did she not?" Alice nodded, nervously wringing her apron. "Yes, miss," said the frost would kill them otherwise. "These past nights have been terribly sharp." "Then where, I wonder," said Miss Marple almost to herself, "did this one come from?" The arrival of Inspector Lennox the following morning brought the usual bustle of official questions. Miss Marple was merely a guest, of course, but the inspector had long learned the wisdom of listening when she spoke. She was not fond of unnecessary drama, and her eyes always seemed to notice the thread others missed. "I understand," he said to her quietly in the study, "that Lady Margaret intended to change her will." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "She mentioned it quite lightly at dinner, said she had grown tired of quarrels over silver and sentiment and was ready to tidy the matter up once and for all. She was not a sentimental woman, Inspector. She was planning something quite decisive, I think." He nodded. The draft was here, in the desk. Unfinished, no signature. Miss Marple considered the inkpot on the desk, still full, the pen clean. She never began then, or someone ensured she never finished. There was silence between them for a long moment. Outside, the wind howled against the eaves, and the rose garden below bowed low in the storm. Later that evening, while the household was steeped in confusion and a carefully masked fear, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Beatrice Lane, Lady Margaret's young companion. Pale, pinched, and always dressed too simply for a house like Everdale, Beatrice had the look of someone perpetually apologizing for taking up space. "She was very kind to me," Beatrice murmured. "But lately, she'd changed." "In what way, dear?" "She'd been nervous, agitated. She kept checking the windows at night. Once I even found her in the rose garden, after midnight, without a coat. She said she couldn't sleep." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Did she say why?" "She'd received a letter. I never saw it, but I heard her tear it up. I think it frightened her." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Did she tell you who it was from?" Beatrice shook her head. "Only that it was from someone she thought long gone." As Beatrice rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes were drawn again to the study door, and to the faintest smudge upon the brass handle. Not dust, not polish, something darker, oily. Her mind ticked forward with gentle precision. That night, she sat with her knitting in the drawing room and heard the muffled sound of argument beyond the hall. She recognized the voices, Colonel March and Julian Darrow, Lady Margaret's estranged nephew. Julian, who had arrived late and unannounced just before dinner, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I'm her blood," Julian hissed, "and I've every right to what is mine." "You were disinherited years ago," March said coldly. "You've no business here." She told me she was reconsidering. She told a great many people many things. It didn't stop her from dying before putting pen to paper. Miss Marple's fingers moved nimbly across the yarn, but her thoughts were not on the scarf. Julian Darrow. A black sheep returned. A missing signature. A midnight rose. A sliver of a window left ajar in the dead of night. The next morning the storm had passed. The garden lay sodden and broken. Miss Marple, with Alice's reluctant assistance, asked to inspect the rose bushes. At first, they found nothing but wet soil and brittle thorns. But behind the northern hedge, beneath the loose brick in the low garden wall, she found what she had quietly suspected: a small trowel, and beside it, a pair of gardening gloves, soiled, but unmistakably of the same fine leather worn by Julian Darrow at dinner. She said nothing at once. The gloves alone proved little, but it was the rose stems that told her more. One had been cut recently, very recently, too clean a cut, too fresh a break. Not by the gardener, she was certain. He was away for the week, attending his sister's wedding in Surrey. That night, she wrote a short letter to Inspector Lennox, enclosed with a pressed rose petal and a single line of note. She didn't pick it. Someone wanted her to see it. And still, one thing troubled her. If the rose was not hers, and not from the garden, where had it come from? As she turned back to the study for one final glance, the evening light casting long shadows across the floor, her eye caught something that had gone unnoticed in the earlier search. A faint outline on the writing blotter, impressed, not written. She moved closer, holding the blotter to the window's light. The page had been removed, but the pressure of a pen had left its ghost. Behind, it was 2 words, a name, and as Miss Marple read it, her mouth tightened and her eyes narrowed in thought. The name was Beatrice Lane, and the rose, she realized, had not been left in warning. It had been left as a message. Chapter 2. The note that arrived too late. The morning after Lady Margaret's death broke cold and grey over Larkswood, as though the clouds themselves had taken up mourning. The mist clung low to the hedgerows, and the gravel path to Everdale Hall glistened with dew. Inside the manor, the fire had not yet been lit, and the walls seemed to hold their breath. Rooms once filled with the gentle clink of teacups and murmured gossip now echoed faintly with silence and suspicion. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a teacup untouched before her. Across from her, the butler, Hensley, stood stiff-backed, his thin face pale but composed. She had asked only a simple question. Who had access to Lady Margaret's study between the dinner and the moment the door was found locked? No one, Miss Marple, at least not to my knowledge. Her ladyship locked the door herself. I heard the bolt slide. You were nearby? In the hall, just preparing to retire the silver. It was near 11. I heard her shoes on the floorboards, then the door close. She locked it. She always did when she was writing her letters. Miss Marple nodded, her mind ticking gently over this detail. She often wrote letters late at night? Always after dinner, Hensley replied. She said she found her thoughts clearer, but last night she seemed agitated. In what way? Hensley hesitated, as if deliberating whether discretion or truth were the more appropriate loyalty. She spilled her brandy, he said at last. That may seem small, but I never once saw her spill anything in 20 years of service. Miss Marple sipped her tea, then rose. Would you be so kind as to show me the study once more? The study was just as it had been. The blotter, the inkstand, the unlit fire, the heavy velvet drapes pulled half across the tall windows. The rose, now dried slightly at the edges, still lay on the desk, its stem clutched by cold, rigid fingers. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly over the desk. The writing pad was clean, but beside it sat a small stack of envelopes, cream-colored, monogrammed with the Darrow family crest. She noticed something she had missed before. One of the drawers was ever so slightly ajar, not open, merely imperfectly closed. She pulled it gently. Inside, lay an assortment of correspondence materials, blotting paper, ink cartridges, sealing wax, and beneath them a single envelope, addressed in Lady Margaret's hand. It was stamped, but not sealed, not posted. The ink shimmered slightly, not quite dried. Miss Marple lifted it delicately. The handwriting was unmistakable, graceful, precise, and firm, but in this note, the last line quivered slightly, like a voice breaking mid-sentence. The letter read, "Julian has returned. I fear his arrival is no coincidence. The matter with the rose, it is a warning. I dare not say more in writing. If anything should happen to me, you must tell Jane." There was no signature. Miss Marple's breath caught just a little. Julian had indeed returned, uninvited, late, and with the entitled air of a man who had come to claim what he believed was owed. And the rose, a warning, placed intentionally in her dead hand, and then the final line, "Tell Jane." Jane, herself. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its place, thoughts already leaping ahead. The letter was never posted. Why? Had Lady Margaret meant to deliver it herself, or had she been interrupted? Outside, footsteps echoed, faintly on the tiled hall. Julian Darrow, tall and sallow, strolled past the study and caught sight of her. He paused. "Still playing sleuth, Miss Marple?" She turned. "Only tidying up small things. I've always found details to be so much more telling than grand gestures." He leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "Do you suspect me? It would be convenient, wouldn't it? The disgraced heir returning just in time for his aunt's untimely death. The will unfinished. Quite the Gothic scenario. Too convenient," she said mildly. "I never trust anything that fits too neatly." Julian's mouth twitched. "I had nothing to do with it. I arrived late, yes, but I was invited. She sent for me." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did she?" "She did," he said sharply. "A letter. I burned it after reading it, as she always requested when writing of family matters." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "How very conscientious of you." He said nothing more, only turned and walked back toward the parlor with a restless, impatient gait. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned back to the desk. The letter, if true, implied Lady Margaret feared Julian, yet he claimed she summoned him. Could both be true? Later that afternoon she took tea with Reverend Allerton and his sister, Mrs. Judith Templeton, who knew everything that happened in Larkswood 3 days before it actually did. "It's all very tragic," Judith sighed, spooning sugar into her cup with affected sorrow. Though not entirely unexpected, Margaret had enemies. "She had a strong will," Miss Marple agreed. "Not everyone appreciates being managed, no matter how gently." Judith leaned in with relish. "She had a dreadful falling out with young Beatrice, you know, only a fortnight ago. I heard the shouting myself as I passed the East Wing. Something about trust. Margaret said she'd made a mistake, that she should never have opened her doors." "Did Beatrice respond?" "Oh, she wept, or so the staff say, and she's been quiet as a church. Mouse ever since, but mice can nibble through walls, can't they?" Miss Marple's eyes crinkled. "They can indeed." She made her way later to the garden path, walking slowly past the rose beds, now weighed down by mist and memory. A figure moved ahead, Beatrice in her simple navy coat, gathering the fallen petals from the ground. "You have a gentle touch," Miss Marple said, coming beside her. "Do you love roses?" Beatrice jumped slightly, then nodded. They were her pride. She told me once that roses remember kindness, but she never said what they do with cruelty. Miss Marple picked up a fallen bloom and turned it in her fingers. "You were very close to her, weren't you?" I thought so. Until recently. She changed. In what way? Beatrice's hands tightened around the gardening shears. She became distant. She no longer trusted me. I don't know what I did. Miss Marple waited, then said softly, "She mentioned your name in a note. A letter that was never sent." Beatrice looked up, sharply. "What?" Miss Marple watched her carefully. "She feared something, perhaps something she discovered. She told me to ask you." The younger woman's eyes shimmered with panic. "I don't know what she meant." Miss Marple touched her arm gently. "Perhaps not now, but when you do, I trust you'll come to me." That evening, as shadows deepened across Everdale Hall and the oil lamps cast long, flickering ghosts along the corridor walls, Miss Marple stood alone in the study once more. She re-examined the envelope, looking not at the writing this time, but the stamp. It was the wrong one. Lady Margaret had always used her special crest-embossed stationery, and the matching stamps kept in a small porcelain dish in the top drawer. But this stamp, plain, common, and slightly torn, did not match. It had been affixed hastily, not her usual careful centering. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The letter was not meant to be posted. It was meant to be found, which meant whoever killed Lady Margaret either did not notice it or wanted someone to find it after all. And then there was a knock. Hensley entered, white as linen. "Miss Marple, I thought you should see this." He handed her a small folded paper, found tucked behind a book in the library. The handwriting was crude, blocky. "Not Lady Margaret's. The rose is only the beginning. She should have known better than to dig up old sins. Now it's your turn to keep quiet, Jane." Miss Marple read it twice, then looked up at him. "Who else knows?" "Just me, and now you." She slipped the note into her pocket, her lips pressed tight. "We mustn't alarm the others. Not yet." The fire crackled beside her, throwing sparks up the chimney. Somewhere beyond the glass, the roses trembled in the dark. She thought of the rose in Margaret's hand, the drawer left half open, the unfinished will, and the strange glint in Julian's eye. But it was Beatrice who haunted her thoughts now. Not the girl herself, but what she might represent. A secret, a reason to be both trusted and betrayed. A motive. And this new note, meant to intimidate, or perhaps to warn. Miss Marple turned slowly, walked to the mantel, and pressed lightly against a panel she had noticed earlier, a loose one. It shifted with a soft click, revealing a narrow space behind. Inside, she found a torn piece of paper. It was part of a letter, water-stained, but still legible. "Can't keep this from you any longer. It concerns Beatrice. If the truth came out, everything would fall apart." It was signed in trembling ink. Miss Marple folded the fragment and held it to her chest, her expression unreadable. Everything was beginning to take shape, but there were still too many shadows. And someone in the house, someone watching, waiting, was growing desperate to keep them from lifting. She turned, and the clock in the hall struck 9. By the next stroke, she would know where to look. But she also knew, with a quiet chill in her spine, that someone else knew she was getting close. And that meant, very soon, they would try again. Chapter 3. The Portrait That Watched in Silence. A fire crackled low in the drawing-room hearth as the storm raged outside Everdale Hall. Rain lashed the tall windows in steady, slanting sheets, and somewhere in the eaves above, the old stonework groaned with the weight of the wind. But inside, all was still, too still. Miss Marple stood alone beneath the towering portrait of Sir Alaric Darrow, 4th Baronet, whose painted eyes glared eternally over the hearth with a mixture of defiance and disdain. She had seen that portrait 100 times before during her visits to Everdale, but something quite small and subtle, caught her attention now. Not the face, nor the stern line of the mouth, but something near the edge, the lower right corner of the canvas, just where the dark velvet curtain of the painted background met the base of a painted table. A detail so insignificant, one might never notice it unless looking with purpose. She stepped closer, lifting a small monocle from her pocket. There, barely visible in the shadowy folds of brushwork, was a rose. A single white rose, tucked behind the sculpted marble bust of some nameless ancestor. It had not been part of the original portrait. Miss Marple remembered that much. The painting had hung in that same place for nearly 70 years. She had once admired the artist's starkness, his ability to resist unnecessary flourishes. But now, here it was, softly rendered but unmistakably fresh in paint, a rose. She turned, slow and deliberate, and crossed to the bell pull. Within minutes, Hensley arrived, discreet and composed as ever, though the long night had carved new shadows beneath his eyes. "Yes, Miss Marple." "This painting, has it been retouched?" Hensley blinked. "Not to my knowledge. It was cleaned last year, as it always is, but restored. May I ask who cleaned it?" "The task was given to Mr. Felix Gainsborough, a family acquaintance. He's something of a dabbler in oils himself." "Felix Gainsborough," Miss Marple repeated softly, committing the name to memory. "He's here, isn't he? A guest?" "Yes. Arrived 2 days ago. Part of the larger house party. I believe Lady Margaret invited him at Julian's suggestion." "Julian again," murmured Miss Marple. "Thank you, Hensley. That will be all." The butler withdrew silently, leaving her once more in the company of Sir Alaric's silent, brooding gaze. She turned back to the portrait. If the rose had been added recently, then it was no idle flourish. It was a message, or perhaps a warning, left in the one place Lady Margaret could not erase without inviting inquiry. But who was the message for? She found Felix Gainsborough alone in the conservatory, sketching absently by the condensation-glazed windows. He was a thin man, silver at the temples, though still young, with long fingers stained faintly with ink and turpentine. He greeted Miss Marple with practiced charm. "You have the look of someone who's just solved a crime, Miss Marple." "I was hoping you might solve a smaller mystery for me," she replied lightly. "I noticed something curious in the portrait of Sir Alaric. A white rose, painted in where there wasn't one before." Felix looked up, one brow rising. "How terribly observant of you. Does that mean it was your doing?" "I did a small amount of retouching, yes. The canvas had faded from the sun. A few flourishes to deepen the shadows, touch up the whites. Nothing significant." "The rose?" He shrugged. "Too casual. A romantic impulse, I suppose. Alaric was known to have courted Lady Helena with white roses. It felt appropriate. Even though it wasn't in the original portrait." "I didn't think it would offend anyone," he said mildly, but his hand gripped the edge of his sketchbook a little too tightly. Miss Marple smiled, but her voice held a quiet firmness. "How long have you known Julian Darrow?" "Years. We met in Paris. He used to talk endlessly of Everdale, of the life he believed he'd lost." "And you thought to help him get it back?" Felix stared at her, the mask slipping for a second. "That's quite a suggestion." "Not a suggestion. A possibility. You see, Mr. Gainsborough, I believe the rose in the painting is not simply a flourish. It's a signature, left deliberately, just as the rose placed in Lady Margaret's hand was not a coincidence. Felix stood, pushing the sketchbook away. I retouched a painting, Miss Marple. That is all. If you wish to find meaning in that, I can't stop you. She inclined her head. You cannot. But truth has a way of surfacing, and I've always believed that those who tamper with the past rarely escape its consequences. With that, she turned and walked back through the corridor, her shoes whispering against the old runner rug. The wind howled outside like a dog at the door. Later that evening, the guests gathered for supper, though the mood was subdued. Beatrice sat pale and silent beside the vicar, her fork untouched. Julian moved with the smug ease of a man who believed he had outplayed his opponents. Felix did not appear. A headache, Hensley reported. Miss Marple suspected the headache was quite genuine, born not of nerves, but conscience. As dessert was served, Colonel March leaned across to Miss Marple. "You've got that look again," he said gruffly, "as if you've just spotted a bloody dagger behind the cheese platter." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "No dagger, Colonel, but perhaps a question or two. Do you recall the portrait in the drawing room? Sir Alaric? Can't miss it. Looks like he'd court-martial you for breathing too loudly." "Indeed. And did you notice the rose?" March blinked. "Rose?" "Exactly," she said, her tone light. "Most people wouldn't. But the curious thing is that Lady Margaret was quite particular about that portrait. She considered it one of the few remaining symbols of true Darrow dignity." "What of it?" "She never would have allowed a modern artist to tamper with it." March frowned. "You think someone changed it after she died?" "I think someone changed it before, and I think she noticed." There was a long silence. Then March said slowly, "You think the rose in the painting is connected to the one in her hand?" "I think it was meant to mean something. Perhaps a symbol shared between two people, Julian and Felix perhaps, or someone else, entirely." At that moment, Beatrice rose from the table, swaying slightly. Her face was white, her eyes glassy. She mumbled an apology and fled the room. The silence that followed was sharp as a dropped teacup. Miss Marple excused herself and followed quietly. She found Beatrice outside in the moonlit corridor, clutching the stair banister with trembling hands. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you're unwell." Beatrice shook her head. "It's not that. I saw something just now. I wasn't meant to." Miss Marple stepped closer. "What did you see?" Beatrice hesitated, then whispered, "Felix, in Lady Margaret's room, the night she died." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "You're sure?" "I couldn't sleep. I went for water. I saw him slip out just after 11. He didn't see me. He looked angry." "Did you tell anyone?" Beatrice hesitated. "I didn't know what it meant. I still don't. I thought he was helping Julian with something. I thought it was private." Miss Marple nodded. "And you never told Lady Margaret?" Beatrice's eyes welled with tears. "She wouldn't have listened. She'd already shut me out." Miss Marple offered a handkerchief and walked her gently back toward her room, but her mind was working furiously. Felix had been in Margaret's room after she'd gone to write the letter, the same letter that had never been posted, and now he was feigning headaches and altering paintings. But to what end? Returning to the drawing room, she stood once more before the portrait. The painted rose stared back at her like a secret waiting to be solved. She leaned in closer this time, studying the brushwork. The color. It was fresh. Too fresh. She reached out gently, pressed a hand to the lower edge of the frame, and found a thumbprint. Smudged, oil-based. She stepped back just as Julian entered the room, raising an eyebrow at the sight of her scrutinizing the painting. "You're determined to wring every last secret from these walls, aren't you?" Miss Marple gave him a sweet smile. "The walls are very obliging when one knows how to ask." Julian's mouth twitched. "Tell me, Miss Marple, do you think my aunt was murdered?" "I think your aunt was silenced. There's a difference." His eyes flickered. "And what would she have said had she lived?" Miss Marple turned from the painting and met his gaze evenly. "That depends entirely on what she remembered and what she found." Julian's smile returned, but there was something behind it now, something feral. "I do hope you're not going to let a painting ruin the party." She watched him leave, then looked back at the portrait. Behind it, she now noticed a small seam in the wallpaper, so faint it could only have been noticed by someone accustomed to lacework and hem-stitching. She reached up and pressed gently. The panel clicked. The wall opened. Inside was a small recess, barely large enough for a letter or a key, and within it, nothing. But on the floor beneath, she found a torn scrap, one corner of parchment. On it, the same rose, drawn in ink, and in the corner, a name scrawled hastily in a trembling hand. Beatrice. Miss Marple held the fragment in the light, her pulse slow but steady. So Lady Margaret had hidden something behind the portrait, something Beatrice was tied to. And someone had found it first. Someone who'd watched from the shadows, like the portrait itself. And now, someone knew Miss Marple was getting too close. She tucked the parchment into her bag and turned slowly toward the window. The storm had returned. The roses outside bent low, whispering secrets to the wind. And inside Everdale Hall, death had left more than a single message. It had left eyes watching, even in silence. Chapter 4. The Will That Was Never Signed. The rain was falling in hard, silvery sheets when the solicitor, Mr. Edwin Hollis, arrived at Everdale Hall. His umbrella buckled in the wind, and his overcoat, though thick with Harris tweed, could not protect him from the damp that seemed to rise straight out of the earth. He stood for a moment beneath the shelter of the portico, breathing in the scent of wet stone and sodden ivy, before Hensley, ever grave, opened the door to admit him. Inside, the manor felt darker than usual. The drapes had been drawn tighter, the fire in the drawing-room low and sputtering, and though it was nearly midday, it felt somehow like dusk. The guests gathered awkwardly, some seated with forced casualness, others standing by the sideboards with brandy in hand, avoiding each other's eyes. Miss Marple was knitting, as she so often did, her needles clicking softly beneath the tense silence. "Mr. Hollis," said Julian Darrow, stepping forward with the confident gait of someone certain the future belonged to him. "Thank you for coming in this dreadful weather. I trust you received word of my aunt's death." "I did," Hollis said curtly, removing his gloves. "A most distressing event. Lady Margaret was not only a valued client, but a woman of remarkable will, no pun intended." Miss Marple, without looking up, remarked gently, "One imagines she would find your phrasing amusing, Mr. Hollis. She had little patience for sentiment, but a good deal of affection for irony." The solicitor smiled thinly and gestured for everyone to be seated. "I understand from the staff, and from Miss Marple, whom I consulted briefly on arrival, that Lady Margaret had recently intended to execute a new will. My purpose here today is twofold: to confirm the existence of such a document, and to determine whether it carries legal standing. There was a shuffle of movement. Felix Gainsborough appeared at the doorway, soaked and breathless. "Forgive me," he said, brushing rain from his coat. "I was walking. The hills have a way of pulling time from under one's feet." "Of course," said Hollis. "Do join us." He opened his briefcase with practiced care and produced a thick envelope, unsealed but stamped with Lady Margaret's personal crest. "This," he said, "was to be the new will. She dictated it to me 10 days ago. We went over the revisions together in detail. She insisted on disinheriting her nephew Julian." Julian stiffened visibly, his smirk curdling into something colder, and instead naming her estate in trust to one Beatrice Lane, with Mr. Hensley as executor and trustee. The intention, as stated clearly within, was to preserve the Darrow legacy through charitable foundations and ensure Miss Lane's continued residence at Everdale. Beatrice gasped. She looked at Miss Marple, eyes wide, face stricken with disbelief. She never said—" "Lady Margaret had her reasons," Hollis continued. "I can only assume she came to believe you were the only one who truly cared for the estate, rather than what it could provide. However," and here his voice shifted, cold and definitive, "the document, though prepared and witnessed in draft, was never signed." A silence followed that seemed to stretch across the stone walls and settle into the ceiling beams. "Never signed?" Julian said slowly. "Then it means nothing. Legally." "I'm afraid that's correct," Hollis said, his tone clipped. "Her previous will, dated 5 years ago, remains valid. In that document, you, Mr. Darrow, are the sole beneficiary." Julian leaned back in his chair with the subtle satisfaction of a predator who had watched the trap spring harmlessly shut. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Do you recall," she said softly, "whether Lady Margaret expressed any urgency in signing this new will?" "She did," Hollis replied. "In fact, she requested I return this week with the final version. I was scheduled to arrive tomorrow. She wanted all her affairs in order by then." "Curious," Miss Marple said, more to herself than anyone else. "She was never one for delay." Hollis glanced at her. "Do you suspect someone might have prevented her from signing it?" "I suspect someone may have benefited greatly from her failure to do so," she said, lifting her eyes to Julian. He met her gaze without blinking. "What exactly are you implying?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, nothing yet. But I do find it interesting that Lady Margaret would go to the trouble of drafting such a document, even having it witnessed, and then not sign it herself, almost as though she intended to, but was interrupted." The guests began to shift uncomfortably. Beatrice had gone pale, and Felix was staring at the fire as though it held the shape of a solution he couldn't reach. Later that day, while the others scattered about the house in their own uneasy silence, Miss Marple asked to review the room where the will had been prepared. Mr. Hollis, though reluctant at first, agreed and led her to the smaller of the estate's 2 libraries. "She insisted on this room," he explained, "said it felt more personal." Miss Marple moved through the room slowly, noting the open ledger on the side table, the faint smell of old pipe tobacco, and a decanter of sherry with 2 glasses, one untouched, the other with a faint smudge of lipstick. Margaret's shade, burgundy rose. No one else in the household wore it. "She didn't like to drink alone," Miss Marple murmured. "No," Hollis replied. "I offered her a glass, but she refused. Poured one for me, though." Miss Marple nodded. "And she wore gloves when signing documents, didn't she? A habit since the arthritis in her fingers worsened." "Correct." She examined the inkpot and pen on the desk. Both had been wiped clean. No fingerprints. But Lady Margaret's gloves had not been found, nor the fountain pen she favoured. "Tell me," she said to Hollis as he gathered his things, "was there any mention of the portrait in the will?" "The one in the drawing room?" "Yes. Was it to remain part of the estate, or be gifted?" He frowned. She had intended to donate several family heirlooms to the county museum. That portrait was among them. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, "because someone went to the trouble of painting something into it quite recently. A white rose. I'd call that vandalism. I'd call it a message, or a warning, and perhaps the key to why this will was never signed." That evening, as the storm began to taper and the air outside turned to a dull, wet quiet, Miss Marple found Beatrice alone in the music room, her hands shaking over the piano keys, but producing no sound. "She meant to give everything to me," Beatrice whispered, her voice brittle. "Why?" "She trusted you," Miss Marple replied gently. "But trust is a complex thing, my dear. Sometimes it comes from affection. Other times, from guilt." Beatrice's shoulders stiffened. "What do you mean?" "She knew something involving you, something important enough to conceal, but perhaps not forever." Beatrice looked away. "I never asked for anything. Number but someone else thought you might. And that frightened them." Outside the window, the roses drooped under the weight of rain. That night Miss Marple sat with a fresh pot of tea and examined every inch of the unsigned will. It was folded once, then again, but oddly so, as if done in haste. The ink was dry, but the page had been scored. 2 small indentations on the bottom right corner, as if something heavy had been placed atop it for a moment. A paperweight, number something softer, gloved hands, no smudge marks, but the 2 indentations told her everything. It was pressed under something, hidden, briefly, and then forgotten. She asked Hensley the next morning whether anything had been taken from the study or the smaller library the night Lady Margaret died. "Nothing missing that I'm aware of," he said, "except the fire screen." "The fire screen?" "Yes, an antique piece, painted. She kept it beside the hearth in the study. But that evening, it wasn't there." "Do you know where it went?" "It turned up in the attic the next day. Quite strange." Miss Marple asked to see it. The fire screen was beautiful, hand-painted with a scene of roses and a swan. On the back, the fabric was frayed, and near the edge, 2 faint impressions in the canvas. It had hidden the will, or perhaps more. She lifted the screen and felt a slight shift. Inside the frame, behind the canvas, a folded envelope, unsealed. Inside was a second letter, a draft, not legal, not formal, but it read, "Julian is pressing me again. He knows I've changed the will. He's angry, unsteady. I no longer feel safe alone at night. If anything happens to me, Edwin, destroy the old will. Beatrice is the only one who deserves this house. She's the only one who understands its cost." Miss Marple held the letter, her pulse quiet but insistent. So Lady Margaret had known she was in danger. She had hidden this message, but Julian had not known this one existed, which meant someone else had read it first. And now, someone was trying very hard to erase Margaret's intentions. She folded the letter and slipped it into her bag. Then, just as she turned toward the door, she saw the reflection in the glass of the attic window. Felix Gainsborough, watching her, and in his hand, a rose. Not white, red, freshly cut. Miss Marple didn't speak. She simply turned to face him and said, "Tell me, Mr. Gainsborough, when did you stop being a guest and start being something else entirely. He said nothing, but his silence was the loudest answer of all. Chapter 5. The Garden That Held Its Breath. It was just past midnight when the figure appeared, slim, cloaked and careful, moving with feline delicacy across the damp lawn behind the vicarage. The moonlight filtered faintly through a veil of drifting clouds, casting a pale shimmer over the rose garden, long since gone to thorn and shadow in the late autumn chill. The wind sighed softly through the hedgerows, and the garden, like the rest of St. Mary Mead, held its breath. With gloved hands and an air of practiced resolve, the intruder crouched beside a clump of dormant briars and began to dig. The soil, loosened by recent rain, gave way with little resistance, and soon a faint metallic scrape broke the silence. Something was lifted, long and wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, damp and heavy. A quick glance, a hasty recovering of disturbed earth, and then the figure vanished as silently as it had come, leaving only a faint disturbance in the mulch and a broken rose stem, bent under the pressure of a hurried footstep. The following morning, the village awoke to a hushed sort of tension, the sort that whispered through the lanes before it was spoken aloud. It was Mrs. Calthorpe, out with her Peking geese for their morning constitutional, who found the body. Poor old Mr. Denholm, retired naval man, a fixture at the Thursday Chess Club, and resident of Rose Cottage, was discovered sprawled at the base of his back garden path, still in his slippers, one hand outstretched toward the gate. His expression was one of profound astonishment, as though the very idea of being murdered had never once occurred to him. By noon, Inspector Cray had been summoned from Much Benham, and the garden gate of Rose Cottage was firmly secured with a length of twine and an air of mild provincial indignation. Miss Marple, who had been in the middle of crocheting a pair of lemon-yellow mittens for her niece's youngest, merely looked up as the news reached her through the well-regulated pipeline of village gossip. "How very extraordinary," she murmured to herself, although I suppose, in a way, not entirely unexpected. It had been, after all, only 3 days since Mr. Denholm's peculiar encounter with Colonel Hargreaves at the Greys' garden fete, a minor disagreement over a mislaid war medal, whispered about afterward with more relish than discretion. And only yesterday, Mrs. Edgecombe, the retired schoolmistress who rented the flat above the chemist's, had been seen emerging from Rose Cottage looking flushed and rather distressed, her sensible brogues clicking sharply on the gravel. Inspector Cray, though not without intelligence, was prone to a certain hasty certainty in his investigations. He suspected quite naturally foul play in the most physical sense, an accidental push perhaps, or a clumsy burglary gone wrong. But Miss Marple, sitting demurely in the corner of the drawing-room while her cat dozed beside the fire, considered it altogether too tidy. Mr. Denholm, for all his naval precision, had no valuables worth stealing and no inclination to fall backwards into his own gooseberry bush. Village life continued, of course, as it always must. Mrs. Bantry called in at the tea shop to lament the decline of standards in criminal behavior. Reverend Toomey's sermon that Sunday was uncommonly fervent, and at the Red Lion, the landlord swore up and down that he'd seen a light in the rose garden behind the vicarage late the night before the body was found. It was this last that stirred something in Miss Marple's mind. "Lights in gardens," she said to herself that evening, pouring a cup of tea, "always mean rather more than one thinks. I remember poor Mrs. Finchley, and that unfortunate affair with the poacher, very illuminating in the end." The following days brought forth a parade of suspects, each with their own small deceptions. Colonel Hargreaves, red-faced and unrepentant, denied any serious quarrel with Denholm and made pointed comments about people who spent their days interfering in police matters. Mrs. Edgecombe, questioned discreetly, admitted to a long-standing dispute with the deceased over a small legacy left to her by Denholm's late sister. Mr. Penfold, the timid church organist, had recently been seen entering Denholm's garden via the side gate. He claimed, rather weakly, to have been chasing a stray cat. Yet none of them, Miss Marple felt, were quite right. It was only when she passed through the vicarage lane 2 days later and paused to inspect the bedraggled rose bushes that it all began to make sense. There, half concealed beneath a layer of fallen leaves, was a flattened area of earth, and just beside it, the snapped stem of a long-stemmed rose. Later, when she asked young Johnny Bell, the grocer's assistant, whether he had noticed anyone lingering about in that vicinity, he frowned and said, "Funny you should ask, Miss Marple. I did see someone, tall, bit of a stoop, carrying something like a stick or a rod, walked off quick when he saw me." A stick. Or perhaps, Miss Marple thought, a sword. By the time she invited Inspector Cray to tea that Thursday, she had all the pieces arranged in her mind. The inspector, weary and no closer to an arrest, listened patiently as Miss Marple poured and passed him a plate of shortbread. "You see, Inspector, Mr. Denholm had something someone wanted. Not money, not valuables, no, something quite different. A ceremonial sword, awarded to him in the war. There was a misunderstanding, you see, with Colonel Hargreaves, who believed it had been meant for him." Cray frowned. "You think Hargreaves—" "Oh no, dear me, no. The Colonel is bluster and hot air. But someone else believed the sword was rightfully theirs. Mr. Penfold." "The organist?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, his father served with Mr. Denholm. There was some dispute about commendations, and I rather fancy Mr. Penfold has grown up with the idea that his family was cheated. A quiet, rather repressed man, but then, repressed people are sometimes the most dangerous." Cray looked bewildered. "But why dig it up?" "Because Mr. Denholm had hidden it. He had refused to return it, and Penfold, well, he must have known. Perhaps he even saw where it was buried, years ago. And when he heard Denholm boasting of it at the fete, he must have acted." The inspector leaned forward. "Then the murder was not premeditated, I believe. Penfold retrieved the sword in the night, but Denholm caught him, perhaps the next morning. There was a struggle, a blow, perhaps not even meant to kill, but it did. And the poor man panicked, dragged the body into the garden, and tried to make it look like a fall. Later that day, Penfold was quietly arrested. The sword was found wrapped in oilcloth beneath the floorboards of the vestry, and under questioning, the gentle organist confessed, tearfully, shamefully, to the crime. The village exhaled, a little sadly, and life resumed its steady rhythm. But Miss Marple, in the quiet of her parlour, merely shook her head. "People are really very much alike everywhere," she murmured, "and most of them are never quite what they seem." The roses, undisturbed now, began their slow return to sleep beneath the frost. The garden, its breath finally released, stood silent once more. Chapter 6. The Guest Who Never Left the Train. It was the morning after the harvest ball at Charnwood Hall, and a damp mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead like a reluctant curtain, unwilling to lift. All through the village, talk turned to the usual topics: baked goods, Mrs. Randall's corns, and the rather tragic new paint colour chosen for the post office. But by mid-morning, that idle chatter shifted abruptly, like a breeze turned cold, when word spread that Mr. Julian Harmon, the heir to the Charnwood estate, had been found dead in the library, his head resting at an unnatural angle beside a crystal decanter of port. Miss Marple, who was at the time tending to a cluster of delicate cyclamens in her front window, did not outwardly react when the news was brought to her by the young and excitable Lily Prescott from the sweet shop. "Murdered?" Miss Marple asked, in her soft and almost wistful tone. "Oh, but I suppose that must be what it is. Julian was never one to drink to. Excess, and even those dreadful stairs at Charnwood, are unlikely to snap one's neck if approached in a gentlemanly fashion." Lily, not quite sure if she was being contradicted or agreed with, left hastily to spread the tale elsewhere. But Miss Marple remained quite still, her small face composed and her pale blue eyes fixed distantly on the mist beyond the hedge. Charnwood Hall, of course, was the pride of the village, a fine old stone manor with ivy climbing like green lace over its southern facade and gables that looked down upon a manicured lawn with an air of slightly judgmental hauteur. Julian Harmon had returned from the continent barely a month prior, bringing with him a touch of modernism and a fiancée, the enigmatic and stylish Miss Madeline Vale, who, by village consensus, was altogether too lovely and too foreign-looking to be trusted entirely. They had been entertaining a weekend party at the time of Julian's death, something of a novelty in St. Mary Mead, where such things were more commonly read about than attended. There was Major Trevelyan, retired from the Indian Army and prone to grand stories and cigar ash on his lapels. Mrs. Daphne Eversley, an attractive widow with a laugh just a little too knowing. Peter Harwood, a young man of vague occupation and sharper than expected cheekbones, and of course Miss Vale herself, who said very little, smiled very thinly, and whose gloves were always immaculate. They had danced and drunk champagne the night before. The villagers, peering from their cottage windows, had watched the motor cars arrive and speculated on the characters within. But of the guests, it was Peter Harwood who caused the most puzzled conversation. Not for his charm or his tailored coat, but because, as Miss Hartnell from the Ladies' Aid Society was quick to note, no one had seen him arrive. "I was at the station," she said, in tones both innocent and expectant, "waiting for my cousin from Shropshire. Only two alighted from the afternoon train. Mr. Harmon himself, and that man from the telegraph office, no one else. And yet Mr. Harwood was there for dinner at 7. Very peculiar." Inspector Cray, again summoned from Much Benham, was inclined to brush this aside. But Miss Marple, who had heard the same from Miss Hartnell during a quiet moment over seed cake at the vicarage, merely tilted her head. "People often make the mistake," she said gently, "of assuming that what they don't see hasn't happened." Cray, meanwhile, had narrowed his suspicions to two likely candidates: Madeline Vale, who would inherit a tidy portion of Julian's estate should the engagement proceed posthumously, and Major Trevelyan, who had argued with Julian that very evening over some matter involving an unpaid debt or a disputed ivory-handled walking stick. Mrs. Eversley, though certainly dramatic enough for mischief, had a solid alibi. She had been in the morning room, playing Chopin badly on the pianoforte at the estimated time of death. And Peter Harwood, well, he insisted he had arrived on the 6:30 train, though no one had seen him disembark. And there was the small matter of the porter at Much Benham, who remembered helping a gentleman with precisely such a valise onto the returning train to London late that same night. It was this, in the end, that puzzled Miss Marple more than any single detail. For if Mr. Harwood had taken the train back, how had he been at the hall all evening, offering witty observations and dancing a foxtrot with Mrs. Eversley? She made a point of walking to the station the following day, wrapped in a dove-grey shawl against the breeze, and found young Tommy Burrows, the station boy, polishing the brass fittings on the ticket office window. "Oh, I just wanted a little information," she said, smiling kindly. "About that gentleman, the one who left his newspaper behind on Friday night. The thin one, with the nice scarf." Tommy blinked. "You mean the one what got back on the train without ever stepping off it?" "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "And did anyone, perhaps Mr. Harwood, arrive at all that afternoon, or only board the train going out?" Tommy scratched his head. "Funny that. Only people I saw step off was Mr. Harmon and that fellow from the telegraph office. But there was a man what stayed on the train, sat there quiet as a ghost in first class, never moved." Miss Marple thanked him sweetly and walked slowly home, passing the manor gates just as Miss Vale was stepping out with a parasol and a distracted air. "Such a curious business," Miss Marple murmured, "to be both present and absent. It does require a certain sleight of hand, doesn't it?" She invited Inspector Cray to tea the following day, as was becoming rather customary, and produced a modest tray of bath buns and her soft conclusion. Peter Harwood never left the train at all. He merely sent his luggage ahead, marked with his name, of course, and arranged for one of the guests, likely the obliging Mrs. Eversley, to mention he was just upstairs or resting before dinner. After all, in a party of 6 or 7, one can easily go unnoticed for a few hours, especially if one is assumed to be there. Cray frowned. But why? To provide an alibi, naturally, and it worked quite well, until someone remembered he'd never been seen to arrive. She stirred her tea. Mr. Harwood, I believe, was not just Julian's friend. He was Madeline's former lover. There was no engagement, not truly. Miss Vale intended only to provoke jealousy, and Mr. Harwood was all too willing to oblige. But Julian found out. There was a confrontation in the library, and in the heat of the moment, anger, perhaps even humiliation, Harwood struck. The blow was sufficient. Julian fell. And then Mr. Harwood, knowing the late train was still at the platform, hurried back and boarded it, returning to London with the belief he'd evaded suspicion entirely. Cray looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "We've found a monogrammed scarf in the compartment, and the porter confirms the description. And the timetable? Yes, it fits. That explains the mystery. The guest who never left the train." Miss Marple nodded modestly, though a faint glimmer of satisfaction touched her expression. "It's always very simple, really," she said. "Once one considers that people lie far more often than they think, and that trains, like people, can carry more than we notice at first glance." And with that, she offered him a second bun. Outside, the mist had lifted, and St. Mary Mead, once again, lay peaceful and picturesque, its secrets briefly disturbed, like silt stirred from the bottom of a quiet pond. Chapter 7. A Whisper in the Wallpaper. The summer sun fell gently upon St. Mary Mead, casting golden slants through the lace curtains of cottages and warming the neatly clipped hedges that lined the village lanes. It was, to all appearances, one of those days when nothing unpleasant could possibly happen, when the greatest excitement might be a cake falling in the oven or a misplaced knitting pattern. But beneath the pleasant hum of bees and the rustling of hollyhocks in front gardens, something old and sour was beginning to stir again, like dust in a forgotten attic. It began with renovations at Gossington Lodge, a modest but rather handsome Georgian house that had stood empty these 15 years, ever since Miss Lavinia Pinkerton had died of pneumonia, and left the property to a distant cousin from Surrey. The new owner, a sleek and gregarious woman named Mrs. Caroline Denning, had taken to the project with a kind of reckless enthusiasm, declaring that she intended to open up the place, let it breathe, and drag it, kicking and screaming if necessary, into the modern age. It was during the stripping of the upstairs wallpaper in what had once been a nursery that the discovery was made. The workman, a quiet man from Much Benham called Mr. Hoskins, had just removed a particularly stubborn section of faded rose-printed paper when he noticed an unusual hollow behind the plaster. A quick jab with a chisel and a low groan of splintering wood revealed a narrow crawl space between the walls, barely large enough for a child to squeeze through. It was dusty, thick with cobwebs, and for all the world, forgotten. Inside were three things: a small silver locket, tarnished but intact, a torn half of a sepia photograph showing a woman in a high-necked dress beside a man with an unfamiliar, stern profile, and a child's rag doll with one button eye missing and a small red stain on its muslin dress. By afternoon, the village was quietly but utterly ablaze with speculation. Mrs. Denning, delighted by the attention and not one to be easily rattled, hosted tea on the lawn and recounted the find with theatrical flair to anyone who asked. But the mood shifted drastically the following morning when Mr. Hoskins was found dead. Crumpled awkwardly in the hallway beneath the main stair, his head struck against the newel post in what was first assumed a tragic accident. Only it wasn't. Not by Miss Marple's estimation at any rate. She had arrived with a basket of scones for Mrs. Denning and had been ushered into the drawing-room just as Dr. Haydock was emerging from the hallway, his expression uncharacteristically grave. "No accident, I'm afraid," he said quietly to Miss Marple when they met in the hallway. "Blunt force trauma. From behind. Poor devil never saw it coming." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes flitting briefly over the polished wood floor, the angle of the body, the faint trace of something. A scuffed mark, barely visible, just beneath the skirting board. "A very quiet man," she said thoughtfully, "and not one to pry. But perhaps, just perhaps, he saw something, or knew someone he oughtn't to." The investigation that followed, led once again by Inspector Cray, who had grown by now both respectful and quietly wary of Miss Marple's unfailing insights, unearthed more peculiarities. The locket contained a tiny photograph of a little girl with a crooked smile and short, curling hair. The initials ERP were engraved on the back. "Not Miss Pinkerton's initials," Miss Marple observed over a cup of lapsang souchong with the vicar's wife, "and certainly not those of her cousin who inherited the house. No, someone else lived here, someone who was not spoken of. Old Mrs. Bunting, who had once been in service at Gossington Lodge as a kitchen maid, remembered something. She recalled a child, a sweet little creature, always hiding away in cupboards and under tables. But she had been dismissed suddenly after an incident that no one had ever quite explained. All very hush-hush," she said, her voice lowering to a whisper. "One day, the child was there, and the next, gone. Miss Pinkerton said she'd been sent away to relatives, but we never saw her again. And then there were the guests at Mrs. Denning's tea that day, all of whom had been in or near the house when Mr. Hoskins was killed. There was Mr. Lionel Trevelyan, an amateur historian from Oxford, who claimed an interest in old bones and village myths. There was Miss Ruth Phelps, who had been staying at the vicarage and seemed oddly distressed by the discovery, though she tried to disguise it with a tight smile. And there was Henry Claypole, the solicitor from Basingstoke, who had handled Miss Pinkerton's will all those years ago and whose presence now seemed both unexpected and curious. Miss Marple took to her knitting with renewed vigor, and a particular frown she reserved for tangled yarn and human deceit. There were, she suspected, two mysteries at play, one of the past, buried behind the faded wallpaper of a forgotten nursery, and one of the present, written in a man's broken body and the silence that followed. It was the photograph, in the end, that gave her the key. The torn image of the stern-faced man had been cropped deliberately, cut across the chest. But Miss Marple, with her eye for detail and her fondness for Sunday supplements, recognized the military insignia partially visible on the jacket. It was not of the British Army, but of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and she remembered, from many years ago, a letter that had passed through the post office, addressed to Miss Pinkerton from a Captain Edward R. Penfold, stationed at Halifax. She remembered, too, that Miss Pinkerton, for all her icy rectitude, had once been seen weeping quietly behind the hedge after church. That had been shortly after her brief disappearance from the village for rest, she had said at the time. Miss Marple had thought it unlikely even then. She gathered them all at Gossington Lodge that evening, the guests, the investigators, and the curious, and in that drawing-room, with its pale floral wallpaper and scent of new paint, she told the story. There was a child, she said simply, born in secret, perhaps abroad, hidden here, in the nursery, known only to a few. She was Miss Pinkerton's daughter, or perhaps her sister's, depending on which version you choose to believe. And something happened, a fall perhaps, or worse, an injury that frightened the household. She looked at Ruth Phelps. You were that child, sent away, your memory hazy. You returned here out of a sense of longing perhaps, or confusion. But Mr. Hoskins, he recognized you. Perhaps he said so, or mentioned the name Penfold, and someone overheard. Her eyes moved slowly to Henry Claypole. You knew the truth, that the will was altered to exclude Ruth, that Miss Pinkerton changed her mind near the end, wanted to make amends. But you never delivered that codicil, did you? You kept it, because Mrs. Denning's claim was easier, cleaner, and you stood to benefit. Claypole's face had gone pale, his mouth opening in silent protest. She remembered something, didn't she? Miss Marple continued gently. The wallpaper, the crawl space, and she went looking. And that's when Mr. Hoskins was killed. There was no dramatic confession, only silence, but it was enough. Inspector Cray placed a hand on Claypole's shoulder, and the man did not resist. Outside, the evening sun spilled amber over the hedges and rooftops. In the garden, roses nodded in the breeze, and within Gossington Lodge, the wallpaper whispered no more. But Miss Marple, returning home with her knitting under her arm, paused by her gate and looked once more at the house across the lane. Children, she said softly, remember more than we think, especially the things we try to forget. Chapter 8. Tea with the Vicar's Widow. The morning mist had given way to a soft, buttery sunshine that filtered through the tall hedges of St. Mary Mead, dusting the rooftops and warming the red brick chimneys that puffed, as they had for decades, their steady little trails of smoke. In the lanes, children skipped over cracks in the cobblestones, and the scent of honeysuckle clung to the gateposts. But the tranquility was, as so often in the village, deceptive. For while the parish gardeners trimmed rose bushes and the women of the church arranged tulips for the altar, word had quietly spread that Mr. Colin Hawthorne, the recently returned son of the late Colonel Hawthorne, had been found dead beneath the yew trees at Cherrydown Hollow, a thin gash at the base of his skull and a scattering of autumn leaves shrouding his body like a pauper's quilt. Miss Marple, who had known Colin when he was a scrawny boy of 11, with a penchant for pocketing biscuits from the Women's Institute tea trays, heard the news from Miss Weatherby in the greengrocer's. She accepted it with a small, polite nod and continued selecting plums with great care. It was not her habit to express surprise prematurely. The circumstances, as the inspector from Much Benham, a well-meaning man with unfortunate sideburns, explained, were puzzling. Colin had arrived in St. Mary Mead only a fortnight before, ostensibly to settle some business regarding the sale of the old Hawthorne estate. He had taken up residence in a small suite at the Bluebell Inn and had spent much of his time walking about the village, asking questions of people who did not wish to be asked. Looking for something, as Mrs. Bantry put it with a certain flair, though what, I can't imagine. There's very little buried treasure in St. Mary Mead, unless one counts secrets, of course. And now he was dead, the back of his head neatly caved in by what the inspector believed to be a heavy iron garden ornament, missing from Cherry Down Hollow's herbaceous border, and last seen, according to the somewhat tremulous housekeeper, Miss Digby, somewhere near the lavender. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had arranged to take tea with Mrs. Caldwell, the vicar's widow, a quiet, softly spoken woman with snowy hair and fingers that trembled slightly when she poured. The sponge cake was delicately lemon-scented, and the tea served in porcelain thin enough to see light through. The sitting room, with its chintz chairs and ever so slight scent of mothballs, remained as unchanging as the woman who presided over it. "I did think of writing to you, Jane," said Mrs. Caldwell after the second cup, "but it seemed so long ago, and I wasn't certain it mattered any longer." Miss Marple, who had known better than to open the subject herself, merely patted the other woman's hand with quiet encouragement. Mrs. Caldwell sighed and turned her gaze toward the window, where the lilac bushes trembled gently in the breeze. "It was during the war," she said softly. "The early days, before the bombs reached us here. My husband had taken on billeting duties, finding homes for those evacuated from the cities. We had 3 children placed in the village that autumn, all from different parishes, but it was the young woman from London who stayed with the Hawthorns. Sylvia was her name. Sylvia Pritchard. Very pretty, quick-minded, too quick, perhaps." Miss Marple nodded. "She and Colin were inseparable," Mrs. Caldwell continued, her voice thinning with the weight of old sadness. "Though he was barely 20 and she just 17. They'd meet under the apple tree behind the schoolhouse. Oh, it was all very innocent at first, but there was something about her, watchful, almost furtive, and then one day she was simply gone, packed off in the night. No explanation, no farewell. Colonel Hawthorne dismissed it entirely, said she'd been a troublemaker. The child she was carrying was never spoken of. There was a silence in the room. The tea clock ticked on the mantel, and the fire cracked faintly. "I see," said Miss Marple softly, "and now Colin returns, asking questions." Mrs. Caldwell looked down into her lap, her hands twisting a linen handkerchief into tight spirals. "I don't know what he had discovered, but I believe he knew that his father had turned Sylvia out, that the baby had been given up. I even suspect he might have tried to find them, her, the child. Perhaps he did." Miss Marple thanked her, gently offered another slice of sponge cake, and walked home along the shaded lanes of St. Mary Mead, her mind knitting together the tangled threads of past and present. There had been 3 other people Colin had spoken with during his brief visit. Mrs. Digby, the longtime housekeeper at Cherrydown Hollow, who had once served the Hawthorns and now lived in gentle retirement on the edge of the estate. Mr. William Blunt, the estate solicitor, who had been uncharacteristically evasive about the original deeds and refused to confirm whether a trust had once been established for an unnamed child, and curiously, Miss Lydia Carstairs, organizer of the Horticultural Society and known throughout the village for her prize-winning delphiniums and unfortunate temper. It was she who had discovered the body, or so she claimed, while collecting seed pods near the west hedge. And yet it was Miss Marple who noticed, during the funeral service 2 days later, that Lydia Carstairs wore a brooch bearing the unmistakable initials SP in tiny gold script. The same brooch Sylvia Pritchard had once worn, she recalled, pinned to her collar in the summer of 1940. Miss Marple remembered it well. She had a particular memory for jewellery, especially those given with meaning. The final deduction came as she reviewed, for the third time, the vicar's marriage register for 1941, which had gone missing from its drawer until it mysteriously turned up in the church belfry, misfiled, according to the curate, but not misfiled at all, for it showed a discreet, hastily performed marriage between Sylvia Pritchard and a Mr. Edwin Carstairs, Lydia's brother, long since dead, in North Africa. The child, one presumed, had been raised as Lydia's own, perhaps in shame, perhaps with devotion. But Colin's inquiries had threatened that long-held fiction. If Sylvia's child had rights to the Hawthorn estate, if a scandal from the war were dragged into light, it would be ruinous. Miss Marple invited Inspector Cray to tea the next morning. He came willingly, noting the lace tablecloth and remarking with some reverence upon the saffron buns. She waited until he had finished his second cup. Lydia Carstairs killed Colin Hawthorn, she said calmly, not out of hatred, but out of desperation. She feared he had discovered the truth about her niece, her daughter, and what that might mean. The brooch was hers once. She passed it down. But such things are hard to forget. Cray blinked. And the weapon? He asked. Still in her potting shed, beneath the sacks of compost, said Miss Marple gently. She'll confess. She has that sort of conscience. And indeed, she did. The confession came that evening, and it was as quiet and bitter as the betrayal that had begun it all, years ago, under the shadow of war and duty and shame. St. Mary Mead, once more, exhaled. The whispers of war faded back into the hedgerows, but Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the dusk settle across the garden, the scent of tea, roses in the air, and murmured to herself, "There is no hiding from the past, not really. It waits, and it speaks, sometimes in the faintest whisper, over sponge cake and tea." Chapter 9. The Scent That Shouldn't Have Been There. It was the sort of day that lent itself to stillness. The sky a pale, delicate blue, and the air laced with the scent of lilac drifting from cottage gardens and the mossy edges of the churchyard wall. In St. Mary Mead, the atmosphere was deceptively calm, as if the world were briefly holding its breath. But the village had not forgotten the murder at Everdale Hall, nor the quiet tension that had settled like dust upon its lace-covered parlour, tables, and doilied armchairs. The victim had been Lady Caroline Greythorne, widow of the late Admiral Sir Bertram Greythorne and matriarch of Everdale Hall, that great time-worn house with its fluted chimneys and cold flagstone corridors. She had been discovered late one Friday evening in her private study, her tea untouched and her body slumped against the hearth rug, eyes wide in what must have been considerable astonishment. A shard of porcelain from her favourite teacup lay beneath her chair, and the heavy bronze andirons had shifted ever so slightly, suggesting a scuffle. But what struck Miss Marple most, upon being told of it by Colonel Melchett at Sunday service, was the faint, unmistakable scent of violets that lingered in the air, cloying, old-fashioned, and completely out of place. Lady Caroline never wore scent, Miss Marple had murmured, knitting needles held thoughtfully aloft. She considered it vulgar. I remember quite distinctly. She once said as much when young Nora French spilt her perfume at the harvest supper. No, if violets were there, they must have come from someone else entirely. The Colonel, who had never yet learnt to dismiss Miss Marple's gentle observations, had returned to Everdale Hall that very afternoon with a renewed sense of purpose. The suspects, as was ever the case in such matters, were contained and familiar. There was Julian Graythorne, the late Lady Caroline's only son, a quiet, nervous man who managed the estate accounts and seemed ill-suited to the rigours of aristocratic lineage. There was his wife, Imogen, lovely in the brittle, translucent manner of fine porcelain, who had once been on the stage and was known to favour a particular French scent, Violette de Parme, as it happened. Then there was Reverend Arkwright, a frequent visitor to the hall, ostensibly for spiritual guidance, though the village had noted his visits became markedly more regular after Lady Caroline's generous bequest to the Church Restoration Fund. And finally, there was Miss Dora Lacey, Lady Caroline's paid companion of some 10 years, whose quiet devotion had been, some said, too quiet. She had a way of appearing in doorways, her hands always folded neatly, her voice low and self-effacing. And yet there was, as Miss Marple had often remarked, a particular sharpness in the eyes of those who are not permitted to speak their minds for too long. The inquest had produced no conclusive evidence. Poison had been ruled out, as had burglary. Nothing was stolen, no jewels disturbed. The cause of death was a single blow to the back of the head, and the bronze andirons bore a faint smudge of something brownish-red. But motive remained elusive. Miss Marple, seated primly in her parlour, with her customary embroidery hoop, pondered all of this in silence. She had seen Everdale Hall in its better days. Garden parties, croquet, stiff linen dresses, and she knew the personalities involved rather well. Lady Caroline had been a woman of firm opinions and sharper memories, not easily deceived and fond of order. She would not, for instance, have tolerated late visitors, nor forgiven personal betrayals. So, when Miss Marple suggested, quite modestly, that the remaining household assemble once more for a small gathering, a memorial tea, she called it, there was, surprisingly, little protest. Grief, after all, often benefits from ceremony, and the village, though curious, was discreet. It was a cool Wednesday afternoon when they gathered in the blue drawing-room, china laid out, buttered scones arranged in neat circles, and tea poured from the Graythorne family silver. Miss Marple sat by the fireplace, her hands demurely folded, eyes bright. "My dear Lady Caroline," she said with soft conviction, "once said that a woman's scent tells more about her than her words. I remember it vividly. She was speaking of Lady Fosbury, who wore too much musk and not enough discretion." Imogen gave a brittle laugh, a very Caroline thing to say. "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "I thought it curious that, on the night of her death, the scent of violets lingered in the air. Strongly so. But you, my dear," she turned gently to Imogen, "you had left the hall that evening, had you not?" Imogen's eyes widened faintly. I had gone to visit my sister in Eastbourne. The train—" "Yes," Miss Marple said with a little nod. "Quite right. and the maid confirmed your overnight bag was gone early in the afternoon. But then I asked myself, if the scent was not yours, could it have belonged to someone else? Someone who would never wear it in public, but might do so in private, perhaps only in the presence of someone who would not object. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Reverend Arkwright looked puzzled. But it wasn't perfume alone, Miss Marple continued. It was the placement of the scent that interested me. The chair, the armrest, the cushion behind Lady Caroline's back. These were not the marks of a woman standing and conversing. Someone had been seated, very close, perhaps even consoling her. Dora Lacey stiffened. Her hands had gone still. I remembered, Miss Marple said, the old Valentine's Fair in 1932. You wore violets that day. Miss Pinkerton remarked upon it, said it was rather sweet and rather sad, and I thought, how curious that Dora Lacey, who never wears scent now, once favoured violets. Dora said nothing. And then I thought about inheritance, Miss Marple went on. Lady Caroline had no surviving siblings, no other children. But she had Dora, loyal Dora, always there, overlooked, quiet, trusted. What if she'd promised her something? A pension, perhaps, a wing of the house, or more. But something changed. Perhaps Julian and Imogen insisted, or perhaps she found out Dora had been keeping something from her. Dora's voice, when it came, was low and cool. She said, I was to be taken care of. Yes, said Miss Marple gently, but words can be withdrawn, and Lady Caroline was not a sentimental woman. If she felt betrayed, perhaps by a letter read in error or a secret learned too late, she would not have hesitated. Dora's eyes met hers. It wasn't meant to happen like that. She said dreadful things. I only wanted to frighten her. She wouldn't listen. Miss Marple rose, slowly, smoothing her skirts. People like Lady Caroline rarely do. But that is no excuse, Miss Lacey. One cannot strike out in anger and expect the world to go on unchanged. Reverend Arkwright reached for the bell pull. Dora sat down heavily, the scent of violets still clinging faintly to her shawl. Later, as the sun dipped below the rose gardens and the drawing-room emptied, Miss Marple lingered for a moment by the hearth. The andirons had been polished, the cushion replaced. The air at last smelled only of tea and lavender wax. A scent, she murmured to herself, is rather like memory. It lingers far longer than one expects. And with that, she took up her umbrella and walked quietly back to the village, her small figure framed against the fading light, while Everdale Hall, with its long windows and echoing corridors, sank once more into silence. Chapter 10. The Murderer Among the Roses. The sun had risen over St. Mary Mead, with the gentle insistence of a polite but determined guest, illuminating ivy-clad walls, the thatched eaves of cottages, and the well-tended lanes that curved as naturally as a countrywoman's smile. The morning chorus of bird-song echoed from chimney-pots and garden hedges, and by 8:30, the scent of warm scones and strawberry jam had begun to drift from the window of the village tea-shop. It was, as Miss Hartnell said with no small satisfaction, a perfect day for roses. But for the villagers gathered near the south lawn of Cresswell Hall that morning, the roses offered little comfort, for among the thick, fragrant blooms of the old rose border, just beneath the boughs of an overgrown, rambling rector, between the heavy blossoms of Madame Hardy and a once-forgotten cluster of Rosa Mundi, the body of Mr. Horace Blackwood had been found, face down in the soil, with a pair of gardening shears cruelly embedded in his back. Mr. Blackwood had only arrived in the village 3 months earlier, having taken the tenancy of the lodge cottage at the edge of the Cresswell estate. He was said to be a writer, or at least the sort of gentleman who left the house after breakfast with a walking stick and a notebook, returning before luncheon with muddy boots and an expression of mild disdain for company. His presence had stirred both curiosity and speculation. Mrs. Bantry was quite certain he was not at all what he claimed to be, and even the vicar's cat had been seen to hiss at him unprovoked. Cresswell Hall itself, long empty and under restoration, was being overseen by Lady Westering, recently returned from a decade abroad and determined to restore her childhood home to something of its former glory. She had opened the gardens for the annual Summer Rose Show, a tradition paused during the war, and had been seen chatting cheerfully among guests only an hour before the body was discovered. Miss Marple, who had declined to enter the rose competition herself, a rose, dear, is a creature that prefers to be admired quietly rather than judged, she'd said, had nonetheless attended, hat neatly pinned, parasol in hand, and a mind quietly observing all. She was at the far side of the garden when the commotion began, but by the time she arrived, Lady Westering was pale. The constable had arrived from Much Benham, and Inspector Cray was already bending over the body, muttering beneath his breath about damned shears and thorns and too many blasted roses. It quickly emerged that Mr. Blackwood had not been a stranger to everyone in the village. Miss Lorna Partridge, a young schoolmistress with clipped vowels and a love of Schubert, turned pale upon hearing the name and was led away by Dr. Haydock. Mr. Denby, the estate manager, admitted that Blackwood had approached him twice with offers to purchase the orchard. Unnatural interest in property, he muttered. Didn't like it. And then there was Lydia Fairbanks, elegant, aloof, and fiercely proud of her specimen rosebeds, who had been overheard arguing with Blackwood the previous week near the Dovecote. Something about the past and keeping mouths shut. But the most intriguing figure of all was Lady Westering herself. She insisted she had no knowledge of the man, beyond his name on the tenant roll, but she had been seen speaking with him at length the previous Thursday, and Mrs. Calthorpe had noticed she wore gloves that day, not gardening gloves, you understand, but the sort one wears when one doesn't want to leave fingerprints. Miss Marple had not said much. She seldom did, until all the threads were in her hands. But that afternoon she returned to the hall, ostensibly to deliver a jar of quince jelly. In the garden she bent over a bed of roses, brushing her fingers lightly over a pale pink blossom edged in cream. Ah, she said softly to herself, how very odd. At tea that evening, she asked the inspector whether he had found anything unusual near the body. Only a handkerchief, he said. Bit of lace on it, probably dropped by one of the women who came running. No initials. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Lace, you say, but not hem-stitched, not the kind one would embroider by hand. No, more like something you'd buy in Paris, said Cray. Why? Oh, nothing, said Miss Marple with a distant look. Only that Lydia Fairbanks has never set foot outside Hampshire. She's terribly proud of it. The next morning, she requested a small gathering at the hall. Tea was laid out again in the rose garden, though rather more solemnly this time, and Miss Marple, with her shawl neatly folded and her expression serene, looked around at the assembled company. I don't believe the murder of Mr. Blackwood was truly about property or roses, she said gently, though both played their part. She looked toward Lady Westering, who sat with remarkable poise, her gloves neatly folded beside her plate. You see, there was a rose growing beside the body, Miss Marple continued, one that was not listed in the garden records, a rare variety, nearly extinct, a souvenir de la Malmaison. Creamy petals, strong fragrance, often used in old French gardens. Difficult to cultivate. Lady Westering's brow furrowed. That rose, said Miss Marple, was planted not this season, but years ago. I remember it from a garden visit just before the war. My niece took a photograph. I noticed it because it was rather wrongly placed. Now, why would it still be there, when the rest of the beds were recently replanted? Unless, of course, someone wished to remember something. She turned toward Lorna Partridge. Miss Partridge recognized Mr. Blackwood because he once went by another name. During the war, he was known as Captain James Barkham. He was stationed nearby, and he betrayed a woman, left her behind after promising marriage. That woman was your sister, wasn't she? Lorna nodded silently. He vanished, and now, all these years later, he reappears under another name, writing, observing, digging into the past. I imagine he sent letters, perhaps to you, Lady Westering. He wanted something, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps money. Lady Westering's lips pressed into a thin line. He threatened to expose an affair, Miss Marple continued. Something from the summer of 1940, before you went abroad. I believe you were very much in love with him, and then he left you with a memory you could not entirely erase. She nodded toward the souvenir de la Malmaison. You planted that rose the week he disappeared, a silent monument. But when he returned, when he turned up again, older, crueler, with talk of memoirs and truths worth publishing, you met him in the garden. You wore gloves. You carried shears. Perhaps he threatened you one last time, and you, well, sometimes the past becomes too heavy to carry. Lady Westering looked at her hands for a long time, then stood, very slowly. I never meant to kill him, she said quietly, but I couldn't let him ruin what was left. No one spoke for a moment. The breeze stirred the roses, and somewhere a bee droned lazily among the petals. Later, as she walked back to her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the matter with gentle melancholy. There are few things more dangerous, she murmured to herself, than an English garden when it is hiding something beneath the roses. And the summer sun, unfazed by death and memory, continued to shine over St. Mary Mead. Chapter 11. The Confession in the Conservatory. In St. Mary Mead, the month of September ushered in the sort of mellow afternoons that made one believe, if only briefly, that time could pause. The hedgerows were ripe with blackberries, the air carried the faint tang of turned earth, and the gardens blushed with late-blooming dahlias and Michaelmas daisies. Miss Marple, comfortably ensconced by her parlour window, had just begun the heel of a complicated sock when a knock came at the door, sharp, officious, and entirely lacking in rhythm. It was Inspector Cray. The body was found in the conservatory, he said, with little preamble, brushing his hat free of imagined dust. Goddard House, you know the place. Large red brick monstrosity, left to ivy and bachelor eccentricity since Mr. Harold Goddard returned from the Indies. He was the one who died. Miss Marple nodded once. She knew it well. Harold Goddard had been something of a recluse since his return to St. Mary Mead, 15 years prior, but he was not entirely without acquaintances. His sister, Miss Charlotte Goddard, a tall and severe spinster with a reputation for moral fortitude, kept house with a rigid efficiency, while his long-time manservant Ellis remained quietly at his side, dependable as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. More recently, Miss Nina Ridley, an elegant, auburn-haired woman of uncertain income and sharp observation, had been seen visiting the house with growing regularity. She, claimed to be a distant cousin, though few could trace the exact branch of the family tree. The cause of death was not ambiguous. Harold Goddard had been struck, hard and cleanly, across the temple with a marble pestle from the conservatory potting bench. Death had likely been instantaneous. The weapon, wiped of prints but poorly hidden behind a fern, offered no defense of accident. "What's strange," Cray muttered, "is that nothing seems to have been taken. No signs of forced entry. And the sister says she was reading in the drawing room the whole time." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And the conservatory doors?" "Unlocked, but not open. No footprints. Groundsman says he saw no one." The village naturally hummed with speculation by tea-time. Mrs. Bantry insisted it was Ellis, always so silent. "It's unnatural, Jane." While Colonel Melchett suspected blackmail. "Mark my words, the fellow dabbled in some shady business out east. Always does something to a man, tropical weather." Miss Marple, however, had already paid a visit to Miss Goddard under the guise of delivering a sympathy sponge. She had found the woman pale, rigidly composed, and wearing her morning crepe a full day early. Her answers were correct, if a touch rehearsed, and Miss Marple had left with the distinct impression that Miss Goddard was hiding something, but not, perhaps, what she believed she was. What truly puzzled her was Nina Ridley. The young woman had spoken to no one in the village, declined to attend the service, and had been seen at dusk walking the old garden path that looped behind the conservatory, the same path that led to the disused rose arbor, overgrown and half forgotten. It was there, at dusk on the second day after the murder, that Miss Marple found her. Nina stood quite still beside the crumbling bench, her gloved hands clutched at her waist. "I wondered if I might find you here," Miss Marple said gently. "It was once rather a romantic little spot. I remember a summer fete here. In 1912, Harold Goddard danced a waltz with the vicar's niece, an occasion rarely repeated." Nina turned, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "You know, don't you?" Miss Marple's voice was kind. "Not everything, only that you cared for him, and that he did not forget you." Nina sat. The bench creaked beneath her. "I met him in Colombo, just after the war. He was older, of course, alone, but kind, and he listened. He gave me a reason to matter." Miss Marple waited. "But then he returned here," Nina said. "He said he needed time to settle his affairs, to speak to Charlotte. He promised he'd write, but the letters stopped. I thought she had turned him against me." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "She never knew. He never told her. He meant to. I believe he left a letter." Nina looked away. "Then she didn't?" "No," said Miss Marple. "She loved him, in her way, but she didn't kill him." There was a long pause. The evening air cooled around them. Somewhere in the distance, a wood. Pigeon called. "He was going to marry me," Nina said at last. "He told Ellis. I found the ring, but when I came to the house that afternoon, he was already dead." Miss Marple's tone was quiet, firm. "And yet you stayed. You walked the garden path. You picked up the handkerchief he'd dropped near the door. You left no trace." "I loved him." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and so did someone else." Later that week, Miss Marple invited the remaining members of the household to take tea in the conservatory. It was an odd scene. Miss Goddard seated upright, Ellis standing discreetly behind her, and Nina Ridley quiet, composed, eyes lowered to her teacup. Miss Marple passed the cream, commented upon the chrysanthemums, and at last remarked, quite casually, "It's a curious thing about scents, don't you find? One always associates them with the people who wear them." I've noticed, for instance, that Lady Aldridge always smells faintly of lavender, even in winter. And Charlotte, my dear, you favor that lemon verbena you ordered from Harrods." Miss Goddard blinked. "Why, yes. How kind of you to notice." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "the handkerchief found beside your brother's chair was scented with rose attar, old-fashioned, rare. Not at all your sort of thing, Charlotte, but very much like the one Ellis's mother used to wear. You remember, don't you, Ellis? She worked here once, in the kitchens." Ellis did not move. "Harold was her father," Miss Marple continued. "He never acknowledged it, but he saw to your education, paid your salary himself. And you loved him, didn't you? As a son would love a distant, silent father." Ellis's voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. He was going to give it all to her. The house, the garden, everything. "He wanted to make amends," Miss Marple said, "and you couldn't bear it." "I only meant to talk to him, to plead. He said it was his right. And something snapped." Miss Goddard made a strangled sound. "Ellis? I never had a name," Ellis said. "Only duty." Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt. "He left you the letter, Charlotte," she said gently. "You'll find it in the rosewood desk. It's addressed to Miss Ridley. He wanted peace. It's a pity he didn't find it before it was too late." As she left the conservatory, Miss Marple glanced once at the pale yellow chrysanthemums blooming against the glass, their faces turned blindly toward the setting sun. "Jealousy," she murmured to herself, "is a poison far more personal than greed, and propriety, a very fine veil behind which to hide a great many sorrows." And with that, she walked back toward the village, toward scones, knitting, and a garden that, unlike some hearts, knew when to let the old seasons go. Chapter 12. The Echo of Dying Roses. The summer had drawn itself thin over St. Mary Mead, stretched like old lace grown soft and yellowed at the edges. The once vibrant gardens of the village had begun their slow retreat into autumn's embrace, petals crinkling at their tips, the first dry leaves whispering across gravel paths. Miss Marple, in her tidy straw hat and dove-grey shawl, stood in her back garden, a pair of secateurs in one hand and a faded bloom of Souvenir de la Malmaison in the other. It was a sentimental rose, fragile, prone to mildew, and prone, too, to memory. She had tended it for decades, and now its canes grew thinner, its blossoms fewer. She bent gently to snip a shriveled leaf when the clink of a gate latch turned her head. It was Inspector Cray, his gait slower than usual, his hat tucked under one arm. "All done," he said, not quite meeting her eye. "Goddard House will be sold, I expect. Miss Ridley's gone back to London. The papers picked it up. Jealousy in the conservatory, would you believe?" Miss Marple gave a soft, almost imperceptible smile. One should never underestimate the romance of a well-placed headline. Cray sighed and looked at the rosebush. "You'll forgive me if I say I'm glad it's over. That business with Ellis, you were right, of course. I suppose I still expect murderers to look more the part. Villains are not always strangers in shadowy corners, Inspector. More often they're people we've known for years, the ones who help, carry trays, or fetch the post. Murder, I've found, is most often born not of monstrous cruelty, but of small grievances left to rot in the dark." She turned a fading blossom between her fingers. "Rather like roses, really. If one doesn't prune back what's dead, the whole plant begins to suffer." Cray nodded, uncertain whether they were still speaking of the garden. The death of Harold Goddard had settled over the village like fog, not thick or choking, but quiet, clinging. The conservatory had since been shuttered. Miss Goddard had gone to stay with a cousin in Bath for her nerves, though Miss Marple had long suspected they were simply the sort best soothed by leaving behind an inconvenient scandal. The village had tried, in its own way, to resume its rhythm. Mrs. Bantry had reasserted herself in the church flower rota. The vicar's wife was embroiled in a debate over the colour of altar kneelers, and Mr. Purvis at the grocer's had reduced tinned sardines in memory of Mr. Goddard. Though nobody quite understood the connection, still, certain things lingered. The case had revealed much, too much, some might say. That Ellis was Harold's illegitimate son had shocked many, though not Miss Marple. The quiet way the man had cared for the conservatory plants, the gentle reverence with which he wiped clean the brass doorknobs, the way his eyes had fixed on the family portrait in the hall just a moment too long, it had all spoken volumes. And then there was Charlotte Goddard. Her upright posture and crisp voice had masked a heart carefully caged by duty. She had not killed her brother, but she had resented the living evidence of his past transgression. Ellis, whom she had treated with cold civility, and Nina Ridley, whose presence had thrown open the shutters on feelings best left undisturbed. What ultimately led Ellis to murder was not greed nor ambition, but a lifetime of being half seen, present but not acknowledged. And when he had learned that the house, the garden, the name he had long tended without claim, was to pass to another, it had been more than his pride could bear. Miss Marple knew, though others might not say it, that secrets behave rather like damp in old houses, creeping silently, peeling at wallpaper, weakening the very bones of a place until something gives way. After Cray left, she sat in her parlour with her tea and the remains of a lavender biscuit. The roses outside rustled in the afternoon wind, the last few petals letting go and scattering across the lawn. She reached into a small drawer and pulled out a photograph, faded but intact, of the garden fete at Cresswell Hall in 1928. There were the Westering girls, cheeks flushed with laughter, and there, beneath the rose arbour, stood Harold Goddard, not yet returned from the East, a young man smiling at something beyond the camera's frame. So many faces in the village now lost to time, to change, to secrets buried like old bulbs beneath the soil. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. She did not fear secrets, but she did, in her quiet way, regret them. Regretted how often they were born of silence, of things not said, of love that turned inward and sour when unspoken for too long. Outside, the sky began to turn. The first gold of evening laid itself gently across the fields. The roses would sleep soon, but the bush would be trimmed back, the soil turned, and in time, if properly tended, it would bloom again. In St. Mary Mead, things passed, and things returned. But somewhere between those two lay the truth, waiting, like a whisper among the dying roses, for someone to listen.